Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 3 of Learning DITA Live 2020. I'm Alan Pringle of Scriptorium, and I will be moderating the first 2 sessions today. And the first session today is Unsung Heroes of DITA by my colleague at Scriptorium, Gretyl Kinsey. Learning DITA Live is brought to you by Scriptorium, the content strategy experts. Since 1997, Scriptorium has helped companies manage, structure, organize, and distribute content in an efficient way. If you're trying to figure out how the DITA model can best fit with your content, or if you're setting up DITA tools and systems, please contact us. We would love to work with you. LearningDITA.com and Learning DITA Live would not be possible without the help from our sponsors. We thank them very much for their help. I want to tell you a little bit about how this event is going to work. During the webcast, attendees are muted, but we still want your questions and feedback. If you would, take the time to locate the chat module on the GoToWebinar interface. You can type questions in there, and we will present them to the speaker at the end of the event during the Q&A session. Also, at the end during the Q&A session, we'll drop a link or two in that questions module, and you will see a link to a survey. We want your feedback on the session, and we'll also drop in a link to an email address if you have more questions. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Gretyl. Gretyl, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello, everyone.
So let me give you presenting control.
All right.
And there you go.
Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to Unsung Heroes of DITA. In this session, we're going to be talking about some features of DITA that can swoop in and save the day by solving your content problems. But sometimes these heroes get overlooked because they're a little more advanced and they can be intimidating to learn how to use. And for some of the content teams that we've worked with at Scriptorium, DITA in general can seem intimidating, especially if maybe your content team has never worked with structure before. So I'm going to be going through some of these more advanced DITA features, breaking down how they work, explaining how we've seen some of our clients use them or how they could potentially be used. And hopefully by doing that, I'll show you that these are not as difficult and intimidating to use as you may think. A little bit about me before we get into things. My name is Gretyl Kinsey, and I'm a technical consultant with Scriptorium, where I've been part of the team since 2011. At Scriptorium, our specialty is content strategy and offering solutions to help companies use content as an asset to achieve their business goals. So a lot of the work that I've done is on assessing content problems and developing content strategies to help solve them. In that vein, I have a lot of experience with information architecture, DITA tools and technologies, and I've also been involved in our Learning DITA training resource since the beginning. I've done a lot of course development, I've created other resources, and of course, I have presented every year at our Learning DITA Live event. And outside of Scriptorium, I love superheroes and I am heavily involved in the comic convention scene, both as a cosplayer and an artist, which you're going to see some evidence of with the drawings that I made for this presentation. So without further ado, let's dive on in and introduce our team of heroes. So we're going to be talking about relationship tables, subject scheme, and advanced conrefs today. Starting with relationship tables or rel tables. So what is a DITA rel table and what can it help us do? Here are the rel table's powers. Rel tables establish relationships among content, such as specifying how DITA topics and a map relate to one another, defining associations among DITA topics and non-DITA resources. And the most common use of rel tables is giving you the structure that you need to generate a list of related links in your output. We've seen a lot of companies set up links among topics using embedded inline cross-references in DITA. And while that is a valid way to set up your linking in DITA, there are issues around reuse with that approach, which we're going to get into in a little bit more detail later on. There are also some issues around link management with inline cross-references. Basically, the more inline links that you have, the more difficult it can be to keep track of them all and manage them all, especially when you do have a lot of reuse. But rel tables give you a way to create a network of links among related topics that exist independently and can be maintained in a single location. So that makes it a lot easier to manage your related links, particularly when you do have very heavy reuse at your organization. So let's talk a little bit about how rel tables work when you need them to come in and save the day. Let's take a look. This is an example of the basic setup of a rel table. The columns show the types of information that you have. And in DITA, most of the time, this is going to be used to separate out topic types. So in this example, you see you've got these columns for concept, task, and reference. You may also choose to have a column for something like external URLs, external resources. Maybe you have columns for figures, tables, etc. But of course, the main use is just separating out concepts, tasks, and references. And so that's the columns, but the rows show different categories of information. And that's where those relationships among different topics are established. In this example, each row includes topics that cover a different aspect of taking care of pets. And this example was actually based on one from one of our Learning DITA courses on maps. So of course, all of our pet information applies specifically to ducks. So the first row here, highlighted in red, contains all of our topics about food for our pet ducks. The second row contains all of our topics about shelter or housing. And the third row contains topics about pet care. So each cell in a rel table can contain topic references to any number of topics. Sometimes it's 0 if you don't have, maybe a task about a certain thing or a reference about a certain thing. There can be one, there could be more than one, as you see in several of these cells. And you can also reference the same topic more than once if it happens to apply to different categories of related information. So in this example, you see that we have done that with this topic, feeders.dita. And that's because it makes sense to include information about feeders both in the food category and in the housing category. So what does a rel table look like in DITA XML? Let's take a look at some sample code. This is the code view of the rel table that we just saw previously. And the first thing that you have is the rel table element. This is just a container element for the entire rel table structure. And that element includes a title attribute where you can name the rel table. So we've called that ducks rel table here. Then we have our header row, which uses the rel header element. And within the rel header, we have 3 rel call spec elements. So there's one for each column in our rel table. And as you can see, each rel call spec has a type attribute, and that's where we define the type of information, so concept, task, or reference. Then after the rel header element, we can have any number of rel row elements to define each row in our rel table. And you can see that this code sample shows the first row from that table that we looked at earlier. The rel row element contains rel cell elements. So you're going to have one rel cell for each column in the rel table. So in this case, we had 3 columns, one each for concept, task, and reference. So we have 3 rel cell elements in the rel row. And then inside of each rel cell element, you can have any number of topic ref elements for those related topics that should be tracked across that rel row. In this example, we can see that the first rel cell element has a topic ref to a concept topic that's called cnourishment.dita. Then the second rel cell element has a topic ref to a task, and that's called tfeeding.dita. And finally, the third rel cell element actually has 2 topic refs to different reference topics. So there's one for rfood.dita and one for rfeeders.dita. So that is the basic structure of a rel table in DITA. This is how they work. And you can keep on adding more and more rel rows to that to track different relationships across your topic types. So now that we've gotten a little bit of an understanding of how rel tables work, I want to talk about some of the benefits that they can offer you. What are some of the missions that we can send this hero on? What are some of the use cases for rel tables? One is making your topics more reusable. Let's say that you are writing some content and you know that there's some relevant information in another topic. If you embed a cross-reference or use the XREF element and link to the topic that way, then that topic has to be available in the same map that you're publishing, or else when you publish it, that XREF won't be able to find the topic and the link won't work in your output. And it isn't a big deal as long as you're only linking to other topics in the same map. But what happens if you have a topic that's full of links and then you go reuse it in a different map and none of those topics that it links to are in that map? Suddenly all of those inline links present some problems because they won't work. And this problem just gets complicated further when many of your topics, or maybe most or all of your topics, have all these embedded cross references, because then you have to be really careful with how you set up your maps just to make sure that all those links will work. And this kind of gets into what I mentioned earlier about, even though it's valid to use these inline XREFs in DITA, it presents issues for reuse. It gets harder and harder to manage all of the different inline links that you have, the more topics that you have, and the more you reuse those topics across multiple maps. So what's better for reuse is if instead of inline links in your content, you use a rel table to show those relationships across different topics. So maybe in map number 1, you've got a rel table that shows how topic A is related to topics B, C, and D. And then over in map number 2, you might have a different rel table that shows how topic A is related to topics X, Y, and Z. So that lets you reuse topic A in both of those maps without any issues. The rel table basically just eliminates all those dependencies of topics having links to each other and having to be in the same map because of inline cross references. So if reuse is one of the big reasons that you're in DITA, if that was a big motivating factor for moving to DITA in the first place, you've got lots of content that you're reusing, or maybe you know that you're going to have a lot of reuse potential with future content that you write, it's better to go ahead and start thinking about setting up all of these links as rel tables instead of inline XREFs. Another use case for rel tables is simply capturing content relationships. And this might seem like a little bit of an obvious one by the nature of what rel tables do, but it's worth mentioning because this is an issue that we have seen at Scriptorium with some of the companies we've worked with. If you are dealing with a lot of legacy content that has to be converted into DITA, or if you're new to structured content, there's a good chance that you probably don't have any sort of information about how the different pieces and parts of your content relate to each other. In cases like that, it's pretty common for somebody to know that. Maybe you have a writer or an editor who oversees a lot of the content and they know about those relationships. Maybe you've got somebody in the support department who works with the content frequently as they help answer customer questions, and so they understand those relationships. But that information isn't captured anywhere besides in those expert users' heads. And that becomes a problem when people, leave the company for some reason, change careers or whatever. It also can be a problem if a company goes through organizational changes and people end up in different departments or gone. So having that information in people's heads as opposed to captured in some way makes it difficult for a new person coming on to understand how different pieces of content relate to each other. So if you're in a situation like that and you move to DITA, rel tables would be a really good way to start capturing information about all of the relationships within your content going forward. So that way everybody can access it. It's not bound to a few people's internal knowledge in their heads. And that can be really helpful for anybody who's authoring new content. If they can look at that rel table and see how the previously written content all related to each other, that can sort of serve as a guideline for rel tables that that author would create going forward. All right, now that we have covered rel tables, it's time to introduce our next unsung hero, subject scheme. A subject scheme is a DITA mechanism that allows you to define controlled values in a map. And much like a standard DITA map uses topic refs to define a collection of topics, a subject scheme uses key definitions to define a collection of custom controlled values. And what I mean by custom controlled values is that you can take all the values that your company might need to specify in your metadata. So for example, all the names of the different products that you make, maybe all of the different audiences that you serve, things like that. You can list those values out so that your writers can choose that from a list instead of having to type those values in manually. And that reduces a lot of chance of human error when it comes to assigning values to your metadata. So not only does a subject scheme let you define these custom controlled values, but it also lets you manage the relationships between those values. In a subject scheme map, you can set up a hierarchy of values and divide those values out into categories and subcategories. And you can also bind those values that you create to different metadata attributes and metadata elements. And we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail later as well. So what do these powers let us do? They build the framework for faceted search. A subject scheme lets you define these custom values, and therefore it gives you a way to classify large amounts of information. And that information can help a lot with the search experience for your end users. So those custom values that you define can be used as facets to set up really controlled, sophisticated search of your content. Now, of course, there is one caveat here, and that is to take advantage of all these search powers, you would need a content management system and authoring tools that support faceted search. So that's just something to think about and evaluate as you are choosing the right tools and setup for your DITA environment. How does a subject scheme work? Let's take a closer look. A subject scheme, like I said a few minutes ago, is a type of map, and to use it, you have to reference it in the highest level DITA map of your content that needs these controlled values. So for example, if you have a book map, and that book map contains a submap for each chapter, and you want all of those controlled values to be available across the whole book, then you would reference your subject scheme in the book map. This code sample shows the general setup of a subject scheme map. So let's break down all the pieces and parts here. First, we have our containing element, and that's just called subject scheme. That contains the entire map. And then within that, we have a subject def element for each one of our controlled values. Each individual subject def element defines a key for a controlled value. So if we look at this first subject def element here, where we've got the keys attribute highlighted in red, we can see that we have that keys attribute defined with a value of vehicles. And so what that does is it sets up vehicles as our first controlled value in this subject scheme. And right away, we noticed one thing, which is that vehicles is not just a value, it's the first level in a hierarchy of values. So within that subject def element for vehicles, we have these other 4 subject def elements as well. And those are nested in there, and they are each defined with a different type of vehicle. So we have a key defined for car, motorcycle, boat, and plane. And similarly, our value for boat serves as a category for 2 specific types of boats, racing boats and fishing boats. So we have a subject def element for each of those, also defining a key, racing, and fishing. Now, let's say that you're a company that produces equipment for all of these different types of vehicles, and you want to keep track of what kinds of people might own or operate those vehicles. You can set up another category of values for that. So, after you've got that hierarchy of subject def elements we just saw where you've categorized your vehicles, maybe then you set up another hierarchy like the one here that categorizes your user base. So you would start by setting up a subject def element and giving that keys attribute a value of users, and that's going to be the kind of main value for this category. And then within that subject def element, you have 3 other ones one each for driver, who might operate a car or a motorcycle, captain, who would operate a boat, and pilot, who would operate a plane. So you've captured the different audiences that you might have for all of the products that you make. So now once we have defined all of these controlled values, what do we do with them? We can use that same subject scheme map to bind each of these values and these categories of values to the relevant metadata element and attribute sets. So let's just take a closer look at how that works. After our subject def elements, we can use the enumeration def elements to bind our list of values to metadata in DITA. And as you can see, we have two different enumeration def elements here, and that's because we previously defined two different categories of values at the root level in our subject def elements. So we had that one for vehicles and we had the other one for users. So we have two enumeration def elements so that we can bind those lists for vehicles and for users to the relevant metadata. In the first enumeration def element, we have these two elements that are required, and that is attribute def and subject def. Attribute def contains the name of the metadata attribute that you want to bind your values to, and in this case, that's product. And then subject def contains the name of the key that you previously defined with that list of values. And in this case, it's vehicles. So what that means in this enumeration def is that we want to bind that vehicles category of values to the product attribute. Now, product is one of the default metadata attributes in DITA that's used for filtering and flagging. So if you want to be able to filter content based on whether your user has a car or a motorcycle or a boat or a plane, then binding those values for vehicles to the product attribute is a way to help make that possible. So when you've got the subject scheme map set up and you reference it in your DITA map, what will happen is that whenever a writer uses the product attribute in DITA, that list of values will pop up with that hierarchy of vehicles, and then the writer can pick the right value from that list. They can choose, whether it's a car, a motorcycle, a boat, or a plane. So let's take a look now at this other set of values that we're binding to some metadata in our other enumeration def element. And when we look at our second enumeration def element, one thing that we notice right away is that there's an extra element that is not in the previous one, and that is called element def. Element def is optional, but I wanted to include it and talk about it a little bit because it can be pretty useful. Element def does something similar to attribute def in that it lets you bind your category of values to some metadata, but this time you're binding it to an element. So when you use that optional element def in conjunction with the attribute def, what you're saying is that you want to bind a list of values to a certain attribute on a certain element. In this case, we want to bind our values to the type attribute on the audience element. And by having this subject def of users included in the enumeration def, we're specifying that we want that category of values for users to be bound to the type attribute on the audience element. So therefore, if a writer puts in an audience metadata element and then adds a type attribute, the values that the writer will get to choose from will come from that list of users, driver, captain, or pilot. So now that we have kind of looked at how a subject scheme works, what can it do for us? How can it help save the day? One thing that a subject scheme lets you do is create a taxonomy of custom values without having to write a specialization. Let's break that down just a little. So first of all, why would you need a taxonomy? If your company distributes a large number of products, they might need a better way to categorize all those products so that the relevant content for each product is easier for the user to find. So for example, if we look at the subject scheme map we just saw, if you are selling vehicles or vehicle parts, your customer should be able to search for the documentation based on the type of vehicle they have. So for example, we saw car, motorcycle, boat, and plane. Maybe they also should be able to search on things like the release version, so 1.0, 1.1, 2.0, etc. Maybe they need to search on the location where it's sold, whether that's their country or their individual state or a hierarchy setup of something like that. So the more products that you sell and the larger and more complex that your documentation is because of that, the greater need you might have for a taxonomy just to make findability of your content manageable. And then what do I mean by taxonomy without specialization? So in the example we just saw, we had our users broken down into types like driver, captain, and pilot. And when we bound that list to the type attribute on the audience element, that let us have custom values for our audience. And because audience is available in DITA by default, we didn't have to specialize anything, but we did allow our writers to have that custom set of values. So if you're in a situation like that where maybe these default DITA metadata elements and attributes work for you and you don't need to specialize a new one, but you do want custom values, a subject scheme is a good solution to kind of achieve the best of both worlds, where you've got customization but not specialization. And this can really be a game changer if you don't have maybe the budget or the resources for specialization, or maybe you don't have good systems in place to manage specialized DITA content. You can still get some degree of customization without having to go all the way into specialization with the complexities and the costs that that can incur. So how does the taxonomy help improve search and delivery? When you put your taxonomy in a subject scheme, that will help your customers find your content in a more sophisticated and targeted way than they could have otherwise. So for example, if your content is just in basic DITA with no taxonomy, your users would be looking through something like a table of contents or an index or using full text search. But when you have a taxonomy like this in place, then the users can do a lot more faceted search, and that can help them pinpoint the content that they need more quickly. And setting up a subject scheme can also lay a lot of the groundwork that you might need for something like targeted personalized content delivery. For example, you could have a situation where a user could log in to your company's website, and if you have this taxonomy set up to run on the back end, that can kind of give the site the information it needs to serve up the right content through a portal based on the information when that user logged in. So maybe it sees what products they own, what kind of role they have, where they're located, that kind of stuff. So whether you are talking about search or whether you're talking about targeted delivery, a subject scheme can really help the user get the right information a lot more quickly. So now let's introduce the final hero in our lineup, advanced conrefs. If you are going to do any sort of reuse in DITA, you're probably familiar with the basic idea of conrefs, which is pulling in content by reference instead of copying and pasting it or rewriting it. And that lets you write it once and use it wherever needed. In a lot of DITA-based product documentation, conrefs are how common pieces of information like safety warnings tend to get reused within your topics. But what about some more advanced techniques that you can do with conrefs? This can be a pretty powerful thing that gives you more flexibility in the way that you reuse content. So we're going to talk about a couple of advanced conref techniques and what they can do. One of them is con keyrefs, and that's a mechanism that lets you reference keys instead of file paths. Another one is conref push, and that is a mechanism that lets you push content into topics and maps rather than pulling it in by reference the way that you would do with an ordinary conref. And if you have a need for any of these more advanced functions that an ordinary conref cannot achieve, you might want to call on one of these advanced mechanisms to help give you ultimate reuse. So what makes things like con keyrefs or conref push different from a conref, and how do we use them? How do we call them in to save the day? Let's take a closer look. So first, just for comparison, a basic conref works like this. We have first one topic, which we have called a warehouse topic, because we use it to store reusable elements. And in that warehouse topic, we have this note here that we are going to reuse. Then we have another topic. So let's say this is just the topic we're currently writing. And in this topic, we want to reference that note from our warehouse topic. So we do that by putting in a note element with a conref attribute. And the value of that conref attribute contains a couple of different parts. So first we have the file path to where our warehouse topic lives. And so we have this topic that's just called warehouse.dita. Then we have a hashtag and we have the ID of the warehouse topic. And we can see if we look back up at our warehouse topic that this ID of warehouse matches the ID that we've defined on that topic. And then finally, we have a slash and we end with the ID of the element that we want to conref in. So if we look back at that note in our warehouse topic, we see it has an ID of hot warning and we see that our conref has that same ID. So when we publish this topic that we're writing, what we'll get in the output is a note that says surfaces are hot. And if you happen to be working in a smart DITA editor instead of just a regular text editor, you might see it displayed there too, but you'll definitely see it when you publish. A couple of things to note about conrefs. So when you use a conref, the element that you put into your topic that you're pulling in by reference has to be the same. So for example, here we have a note in the topic that we're writing because the element that we want to conref in is also a note. For example, if we put in a paragraph here and then tried to have a conref to pull in that note, that wouldn't work. The elements have to match. And also when you use a conref, both of these two elements, the one that you are referencing and the one that you've set up with the conref, have to be valid. So for example, if you are using a more complex element, so let's say you're doing a list, or let's say you're doing a set of steps, and that element has to have required elements that go inside it. So for a UL, you have to have LIs, for example. Both of your elements, the one that you're referencing and the one that you've set up in the topic that you're writing, have to be valid according to that structure. So for example, you can't be missing an LI within a UL, or you can't be missing a command within a step. They both have to be valid for the conref to work. So how do these advanced conref mechanisms we talked about, conkeyrefs and conref push, expand on the principle of conrefs? Let's take a look first at conkeyref. The biggest difference between a conkeyref and a regular conref is that we are going to be referencing a key instead of a file path. And the reason we might want to do this is because maybe you want an element in a topic to reference different information in different maps. For example, if our topic that we're writing about kitchens is in a map that is for cooking professionally versus another map that's for cooking at home, we might want different warnings to appear to our audience in that reference note. So how do we accomplish something like that? One thing in the map where our topic is contained, we're going to set up a key for our warehouse topic. So we have this key that we're defining, and the key's attribute is defined as warehouse. And the topic it points to is pro-warehouse.dita, which is going to be a warehouse topic containing elements for pro cooks. Then in our warehouse topic, pro-warehouse.dita, we have this same note that we saw before with an ID of hot warning, and that's the note that we want to reference via conkeyref. So to do that, and the topic we're writing and that we've put in our map, instead of using the conref attribute on the note, we want to use the conkeyref attribute instead. And the value for the conkeyref attribute only contains two parts, unlike it does for conref. So first you have the name of your key, and you can see above that it matches warehouse where we have our key definition of the map. And one thing to note with a conkeyref, it doesn't matter what that warehouse topic's ID is, you want to use the key definition instead. So then the second part of our conkeyref value is a slash and then the ID of the element you're referencing. So this is what's similar to what we saw before with conrefs. And in this case, we can see that our ID matches hot warning. It matches the ID attribute that's on that note in the warehouse topic. So when you publish this map for your professional cooks, you're going to get a note that says surfaces are hot. But what's great about con key refs is you can change out the warehouse topic in your key definition from one map to another. So let's say we set up a different map for people who are learning to cook at home for the first time, and we set up a different warehouse topic for them with different notes and warnings and other stuff, and we can point to that warehouse topic in our key definition. So for example, if you look at the key definition, you can now see that we have set it up to point to home warehouse.data instead of pro warehouse.data. So it's going to get us that set of warehouse elements. And then when the topic that we're writing that we have in our map is for home cooks, and we publish that map for home cooks, we automatically get this other note via our con key ref instead. So we get one that says surfaces are extremely hot, be careful, instead of just the one for pro cooks that simply says surfaces are hot, because they know that. So this gives us a lot of flexibility in reuse compared to what we would get with ordinary conrefs, because instead of referencing one single file path to a single warehouse topic, you can just set up that key and then you can substitute in different warehouse topics for that definition. And if you have multiple versions of your content for different product lines, different audiences, different locations, etc., con key refs might be a really good way to set up a lot of your reuse, because it's so easy to just switch out which different notes and warnings and lists and tables and other things that you get that's specific to each audience. So that's con key ref. Now let's take a look at conref push and how that works. A regular conref lets you pull in a reusable element by reference into your topic, but conref push lets you insert or push content from one topic into another. And this is most commonly used in scenarios where you need to do something like add a step to a task or maybe replace an item in a list. And this is not just limited to topics. You can also use conref push to add things like topic refs, map refs, or metadata to your maps. So let's break this code sample down here a little bit and talk about how this all works. First, you're going to need a topic that the content will be pushed into. So in this case, we've got a task topic that's called developing a content strategy. And that topic needs to have the element that you'll be pushing your content around or replacing it with, such as the step. And that element needs to have an ID. So in this case, you can see that we have given our step element an ID of established goals. And then the second thing that we need is a separate topic where we're going to write another step, and that's the one that you are going to be conref pushing into that first topic. So using the conref and conaction attributes, that's going to be what makes conref push possible. So in this particular case, we are replacing the step in our first topic with this one. And let's take a look at how our conref push mechanism works, broken down piece by piece. The first thing is we have the conref attribute. And this is the same kind of setup we saw before, just a basic conref. So you've got this value where you have the name of your file, then hashtag your topic ID, and then slash your element ID, just standard conref. But what makes conref push different is this piece here after it, the con action attribute. So in here, you can see that we have given this attribute a value of push replace, and that tells us we're going to be replacing the step in our other topic with this one. So when we publish this content strategy task topic up here, the step we originally had that says establish implementation goals and metrics is going to be replaced in the output with this new step that says define implementation goals and metrics. Now, instead of just replacing that step, let's say maybe you wanted to add a step before it or after it. In that case, you would set up your conref push a little bit differently. If you want to push your new step before the one in your task topic, then you would define two steps in the topic you're currently writing. The first one is the step that needs to get pushed into the topic, and the second step marks where you're going to push it. So in our first step, we have this ConAction attribute with a value of push before, and that indicates that this step should be pushed in front of the one that we've marked. And then in our second step, we have our conref attribute pointing to the relevant step in our task topic. And then we have a ConAction attribute with a value of mark. So what that does is it's just going to mark that step in our task topic that has that idea of established goals, and that's going to set that up as the target for the conref push, so that when the content gets published, you see this new step, identify and interview stakeholders, before that step in your task topic. The same principle applies when you want to push a step after the one in the task topic, except it's set up in reverse. So this time, the first step we have put here has that conref to the target element and that ConAction mark. And then it's the second step here that defines what content's going to get pushed into that topic. And that uses the attribute, the ConAction attribute with this value of push after. So in both of these cases, you will get that additional step before or after your target step in your task topic whenever you publish your content. When it comes to these advanced conrefs we've just talked about, conkeyrefs and conref push, what are some situations where you might call on one of them to save the day? One case is when you have customized content where maybe the bulk of it is the same, but then you've got some additions here and there that apply to each specific segment of your audience that you're delivering your content to. For example, if you make software, you would want to deliver the base documentation for that software to all of your customers, but then if there are certain features or add-ons that the customer can buy on top of that software, you would want to augment that main documentation set with some additional documentation about those features. So that's a case where conref push could really help you. Maybe in your documents, you've got steps about setting up your software, and you want to push one in that says, if you've bought this feature, then do this. Another case is if you need any sort of audience specific information in your content, for example, location specific requirements that's added to your content, role specific information for different segments of your user base. This is a case where conref push or conkeyrefs or both might be really helpful in that kind of situation, because you can use conref push to add or replace information depending on that specific audience, or you can change out and have different maps where you're changing out your key definitions to your warehouse topics and using conkeyrefs. Another thing that these mechanisms can help with is reuse across departments. Suppose that you have product documentation that's made by one team. So let's say it's made by your tech pubs team. And then you also have your training team that shares the bulk of that content, but each team has some specific information that they need to include or exclude based on what they are delivering to their users. So conref push can allow each team to add specific information to a main shared document set without having to be saddled with each other's content or worrying about filtering it out. And of course, filtering is a perfectly valid thing to do in DITA, but depending on how your setup is, conref push might make more sense. And this could also be a case where conkeyrefs might help, because you could have, let's say your pubs team has their own maps with different keys defined for their warehouse topics, and then training, same thing. They've got their separate maps with their different keys defined for their own warehouse topics. And then both teams agree to use conkeyrefs across the board to help make reuse between their two different departments work. So when you've got reuse across departments, that's where some of these advanced mechanisms might really help a lot more than just ordinary conrefs. Now that we have gotten to know all of our unsung heroes pretty well, and we've seen how powerful they can each be, I want to talk about what happens if you use them together, because we all know heroes work better when they assemble. So I'm going to wrap things up by talking a little bit about what happens when you bring these unsung heroes together as a team. So team missions, how might you use some of these DITA features in conjunction with each other? Just to recap a little bit of what we've discussed, a lot of it all comes back to reuse. If you have a DITA environment with significant reuse, all three of these heroes can help you out. Your rel tables can make your topics more reusable across multiple maps or documentation sets. Your subject scheme can be reused in any maps where your controlled values are needed, and you can even have multiple different subject scheme maps defining different sets of values that you could use and reuse in different places if you want. And then, of course, your advanced conrefs can facilitate very flexible reuse in several different ways depending on what you need. So how might that level of reuse help you? If you are translating your content into other languages, then the level of reuse and the sophistication of that reuse can really help save a lot of those localization costs. When you only have to write content once and reuse it, that also means you only have to translate it once per language as opposed to translating multiple copies of the same content. So the more languages that you're translating into, the more cost you can save with reuse. And so again, that's a case where these heroes might be able to step up to the plate, because if you really maximize that reuse potential with whatever mechanisms you can, then that cuts down on those localization costs. Reuse is also really important when you are delivering custom variants of your content to your users based on things like their product configurations, their roles, their locations, that sort of stuff. In cases like that, you often have, like I talked about with some of the other examples with conrefs, you often have that core set of content that's reused, and then you might have additional specific content that's for each deliverable for the different parts of your user base. So that's a case where some of these unsung heroes might also come into play. A subject scheme can be really helpful when you've got custom content to deliver like this, because it can establish a consistent taxonomy across all of your content with some values that are used across the board and then maybe others that are relevant for specific pieces of the content. But it can just help keep all that really consistent. And of course, these advanced conref mechanisms like conref push and conkeyrefs can be helpful here too, especially if you do have that situation where I described where you've got sort of a main set of content and other content that needs to be added to it. So when you're setting up your content for custom targeted delivery to your users, it's really important to think about what kinds of reuse that you have, how much reuse you have, and what kind of reuse strategy you want to have in place to maximize that potential. And then that can help you know maybe which of these unsung heroes would be best suited for the job. At the end of the day, these unsung heroes of DITA have a lot of power and a lot of potential, especially in a workflow where reuse is one of your biggest factors for being in DITA. So even though they might be a little bit intimidating to learn, don't be afraid to make them part of your strategy, because after all, you never know when you might need these heroes to come in and save the day, or at the very least, to save you cost and time when it comes to producing your content. And with that, I want to open things up for questions.
And we do have a few. First of all, can you use the push function with a key ref as well as with a conref?
That one I'm going to have to look up, I think, and get back to you via email.
We can certainly do that, because off the top of my head, I can't answer that question either.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a specific scenario where that might be useful, but that's something that I'll definitely do some more research into and see kind of what the possibilities are there. And then not only, is it possible, but what the use case would be for that.
Yeah. How well in general do the authoring and content management systems for DITA support these advanced features that you're talking about here?
That really depends on the particular tool, and that's something that we actually help our customers really evaluate thoroughly. So if we have a situation where we know there's a lot of reuse or a lot of reuse potential, and we know that they're going to want to use or need to use something like a subject scheme, something like conkeyrefs, conref push, rel tables, then one of the things we would do when we are evaluating authoring tools, content management tools, etc., is ask them to demonstrate how does this work, because that is a thing that can be kind of an issue, is the consistency of how well different tools support these different mechanisms. All of them are supported in the sense that when you publish your content, they will work. But what's different from each tool, kind of one to the next, is that some of them will show you that function in your editor as you're working. So for example, if you're using a certain authoring tool that supports conref push, then you might actually be able to see like a little preview of that step or list item or whatever that you're pushing in. Whereas other ones, won't show that in a preview for the author, but it will be shown in the output when you publish. Another thing that we look at with tools, especially with content management systems, is how well there's kind of an infrastructure in the user interface. So for example, is there kind of a button or a menu where a user can just insert, a rel table, or insert, a con keyref, define your keys for that, and then set up your con keyref? Does it let you kind of go through and build the different parts of your con keyref or your con ref through some sort of a guided menu, or does it make you just go into the code view and type it out? So those are the sorts of things that we kind of help evaluate with these tools and help the customer choose a tool that's going to suit them. Because what you don't want is to pick something that forces you to do all of this kind of on the back end in the code, but doesn't really have an interface for it, especially if you have authors who have never worked with DITA or structured content before. But yeah, the basic answer to the question is it depends. Each tool kind of has different support for these different advanced mechanisms, and so it's really worth evaluating that thoroughly and asking different vendors to demonstrate what their tools can do.
Yeah, I think that's very important during the demo, even before the demo. Tell the vendor, we want to see these things used. And if you've got a little bit of content that you can send their way that they may be able to use, that would be great too, so you can see it, in your real content. But regardless if, they've got your content or not, I think it's really wise to be very specific about what you want to see in a demo from a vendor.
Absolutely. Yeah, and some vendors are also open to, maybe their system doesn't support it, but if they see enough people asking for that support, they will work on adding it. So that's another thing, is just to be really upfront about what kind of support that you want for each of these kind of advanced data features. And then that way these tool vendors know there's a demand for it, and then the more likely it will be that that will be available at some point.
Yes. And while we're waiting for the next question, please look in the chat module for a link to a survey. We very much want your feedback on this and the other sessions at this event. Also, I realize Gretyl has thrown a lot of fairly complex technical stuff at you. If you can't think of a question now but have one later, please send it to experts@learningdita.com and we'll be sure that it's forwarded to her. One other question, how can you ensure that all authors are using the same values in a subject scheme when they're working on different computers and different authoring tools?
So the subject scheme helps with that, because they are picking from that control list. As far as making sure they are choosing the right value from the list, that really is just kind of more of a training and content governance thing. So you would need to have some sort of guidelines in place where you would say, if you are going to be writing a topic for this audience, then this is the value you would pick from the list. But that is one thing that with the subject scheme, it really helps with that, because without one, what would be happening is your authors would just be saying, let's say audience type equals, and then they would just be typing in a word. And so that's where you would get all of that kind of inconsistency. So the subject scheme does help add a layer of eliminating human error, making things more consistent, because they do have that pick list of values to choose from. But yeah, as far as just making sure they choose the right value, that's just a matter of having standards set up and making sure that's communicated really well to all of your writers.
That's great. And in response to the person asking about recordings, we are posting recordings of all sessions, so you'll be able to go back and review this content, or if you missed it altogether, you can get it the first time from those recordings. And we have time for one more question. Anything else? Well, Gretyl, thank you very much. I think that is it.
All right, thank you.